My wife Megan was so excited. I mean, who wouldn't be? It was Christmas Eve, and our house was buzzing with the kind of warmth only a holiday could bring. The lights on the tree twinkled like little stars, casting their glow over the living room, and the smell of cinnamon and pine hung thick in the air. Megan had been planning everything for weeks, decorating, baking, making sure every little detail was perfect for our family's Christmas tradition. It had been a year since we'd moved into this old house, nestled in the outskirts of the city. The kind of house that felt as though it had a life of its own. The creaking floors, the long hallways, the high ceilings that made every room feel grand but distant. There was something about it that seemed to draw you in. Or at least, it had for us. We were settled, content. The kids, Luke and Lily, were still young enough to get excited over the smallest things. Luke was 5, and Lily was 7, both running around the house, their laughter echoing through the halls as they tried to sneak peeks at the presents under the tree. Megan was glowing that night, more than usual. The holiday spirit had her giddy, and I couldn't blame her. We were a family, and everything was perfect. I remember her taking my hand as we stood by the tree, admiring the lights, and the soft sounds of Christmas carols filling the air. "I've never been this happy," she whispered to me, her eyes shining. I smiled, squeezing her hand. "I know, I feel the same." But something shifted. A change, like a breath held too long, the air growing thick. It wasn't in Megan. It wasn't in the kids. It was in the house. The atmosphere seemed to thicken, a pressure that pressed down on my chest like the weight of an unseen hand. It was close to midnight. The children had been put to bed hours ago, and the house was finally quiet. The only sounds were the occasional creak of the house settling and the soft hum of the tree lights. I was standing in the kitchen, rinsing the last of the holiday dishes, when I heard it, a strange, sharp click. My head snapped to the side, toward the living room, where Megan had been. My stomach dropped. Something wasn't right. I walked slowly, cautiously, down the hallway, my eyes scanning the darkened rooms. The living room was dimly lit, only the faint glow of the Christmas lights illuminating the space. But there, standing before the tree, was Megan. At first, I thought she was just admiring the decorations. But as I got closer, something was wrong. The way she stood motionless, her hands clenched at her sides, it wasn't like her. Megan wasn't the type to be still like that. The air felt cold now, colder than it had any right to be. My breath caught in my throat. "Megan?" I called, my voice barely a whisper. She didn't respond. Not even a flicker of acknowledgement. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something primal within me began to stir, warning bells going off in my head. I was terrified, but I couldn't understand why. I approached her cautiously, each step heavier than the last. The room seemed to press in on me, the walls closing in. "Megan, what's wrong?" I asked again, trying to keep my voice steady. That was when she turned slowly, her head jerking toward me with an unnatural snap. Her eyes, my God, her eyes, were wide, unblinking, and empty. There was no recognition there, no warmth, no love. Just cold, dead space where my wife's soul should have been. "Megan?" I whispered, my heart racing. She didn't speak. Instead, her lips curled into a twisted, unnatural smile, too wide, too forced, as if it wasn't her at all. My blood turned to ice. Then, without warning, her right hand reached for the shotgun leaning against the wall near the tree. I froze, my stomach dropping into my feet. I couldn't move, couldn't think. I watched in horror as she lifted the gun to her shoulder with slow precision, her movements mechanical, deliberate. "Megan, please," I pleaded, my voice trembling. "Put the gun down." But she didn't listen. Her eyes remained fixed on me, devoid of any recognition. It was like she was a stranger, a thing, something that wore her face but wasn't her at all. She pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, deafening in the silence of the house. I staggered back, the noise ringing in my ears, my heart leaping into my throat. It wasn't until the acrid scent of gunpowder hit my nose that the full horror of what had just happened sank in. I turned, panic gripping me, as the blood-curdling realization settled in. My children, my babies. I rushed to the hallway, my legs shaking, my mind racing. The house felt like it was closing in on me. I reached the doorway to their room, the door ajar. The pale moonlight outside cast long shadows across their beds. And there they were. Luke and Lily. They were motionless. I staggered forward, my chest tight, the air thick with a suffocating heaviness. I knelt beside them, shaking them, calling their names, Luke, Lily, but there was no response. No movement. I felt their cold skin, their tiny bodies stiff and lifeless. The horror of it struck me like a physical blow. They were gone. I could hardly breathe. I felt like I was drowning. I didn't know where I was anymore, or what was happening. The world was spinning, slipping away from me. I stumbled back into the living room, and Megan was still there, standing before the tree, the shotgun in her hands, her cold eyes locked onto me. She tilted her head, that unnatural smile still plastered on her face, and in that moment I knew it wasn't her. Whatever had taken her, it was still here, still inside her. I wanted to scream, to run, to fight. But something kept me frozen, something beyond my control. I couldn't tear my eyes away from her, from the twisted, empty shell that wore her face. Then, like a switch had been flipped, she lowered the gun and turned her back to me. She walked toward the Christmas tree, and the lights flickered once, just once, before they dimmed entirely. I didn't know how long I stood there, my body trembling, my mind in a fog of disbelief. All I could hear was the sound of my own heart thundering in my chest. When I finally moved, it was to reach for the phone. I dialed 911, my hands shaking, my throat tight with terror. I could barely speak, but somehow I managed to explain what had happened. What I thought had happened. It felt like I was speaking from a distance, like I wasn't really there at all. The police arrived hours later. They searched the house, but they found nothing. No sign of Megan. No sign of what had happened. The only evidence was the shotgun, still in her hands, resting against the tree. They asked me questions. A lot of questions. But I couldn't answer most of them. I didn't know what was real anymore. I didn't know what had taken my wife, or if it was even her at all. Megan was never found. Neither was the demon, or whatever it was, that had taken her. The house, once full of joy, now sits in eerie silence. I haven't been able to bring myself to celebrate Christmas since. The lights on the tree no longer shine. The gifts remain untouched, forgotten in the wake of that night. And every year, at midnight, I can hear it. The softest click, followed by a faint whisper of movement in the house. And I wonder if she's still out there, if whatever took her still lingers in the shadows, waiting to finish what it started. I'm left here, alone, with nothing but the haunting memory of that Christmas night. Everything was going very well. The Christmas tree was shining brightly in the corner of our living room, its multicolored lights twinkling softly, casting a warm glow throughout the house. The scent of pine filled the air, mixing with the faint smell of gingerbread cookies baking in the oven. The house felt alive with the holiday spirit. My husband, James, was curled up on the couch next to me, his arm around my shoulder, both of us enjoying the calm after a day full of family and celebration. Our two children, Lily and Noah, had long since fallen asleep in their rooms, their soft breathing the only sound in the quiet house. As I looked at the tree, I felt a warmth spread through me. It was our first Christmas in this house, a cozy little place on the edge of a forest, far from the bustle of the city. We had chosen this home for its quiet beauty, the way the trees seemed to whisper their secrets, and the way the snow would blanket everything in winter. It felt like the perfect place for our family to create new traditions. But then, something broke the peace. It was close to midnight when I felt a sudden chill in the room. At first, I thought it was just the cold air creeping in through the windows, but as I turned to James, I noticed something strange. He was no longer beside me. The spot on the couch was empty, and the blanket that had been draped over him was now crumpled on the floor. I froze for a moment, trying to understand what had happened. My eyes adjusted to the darkness of the room, and I heard the faintest sound, footsteps, quick and erratic. My heart started to race. I stood up, calling his name softly at first. "James? Are you okay?" There was no answer. The footsteps continued, growing louder, and then the front door creaked open. I rushed to the window, peeking through the curtains, but it was too dark to see clearly. The only thing I could make out was his silhouette, barefoot, running into the night, his steps quick and desperate. Panic surged through me. What in the world was going on? I grabbed my coat, my hands shaking as I tried to make sense of the situation. I had to go after him, but my mind was racing with questions. Why would he run out into the night barefoot, in the middle of winter? I barely had time to think as I threw open the door and stepped into the cold air. The darkness outside was suffocating, the only sound the crunch of my footsteps in the snow as I followed the trail James had left behind. The house was surrounded by dense woods, the towering trees casting long, twisted shadows in the moonlight. The wind howled through the branches, and the air was thick with an eerie stillness. I called his name again, my voice trembling, but there was no reply. My breath came in short bursts, visible in the cold, as I pushed through the snow, my feet growing numb from the cold. The woods seemed to close in around me, the trees whispering in a language I couldn't understand. My heart pounded in my chest, and my thoughts spiraled into panic. What was going on? Where had he gone? Then I heard it. A scream. It wasn't a scream of fear or pain, it was something far worse. It was a sound that chilled me to my core, a heart-curdling cry that echoed through the trees. The scream came from deeper in the woods, somewhere beyond the path James had taken. My stomach twisted, and I felt a wave of nausea rush over me. I had to get to him. I pushed forward, ignoring the sharp branches that scraped at my skin, ignoring the way the darkness seemed to stretch and bend unnaturally around me. The scream echoed again, louder this time, and it sounded like James, but something was wrong. His voice didn't sound like his own. It was distorted, filled with terror and pain. I stumbled forward, my legs shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I ran deeper into the woods. The snow crunched beneath my feet, and the wind howled through the trees. I felt like I was being pulled into the very heart of the forest, but I didn't know why. It was as though some invisible force was guiding me, or perhaps dragging me towards something I couldn't escape. The trees seemed to part ahead of me, and I saw a clearing in the distance. My heart raced as I pushed forward, fear surging through me. What was happening? What was I about to find? As I entered the clearing, I stopped dead in my tracks. James was there, standing in the center of the snow-covered ground. He was barefoot, his clothes disheveled, his eyes wide with fear. But there was something wrong with him, something unnatural. His skin was pale, and his breathing was shallow, as though he hadn't been breathing properly for some time. His body trembled, and his gaze was fixed on something in the distance, his eyes wide with terror. I called out to him, my voice breaking. "James! What's going on? What happened?" He didn't respond. His gaze remained fixed on the shadows at the edge of the clearing. I stepped forward, my heart pounding in my chest, but as I got closer, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. It was as though something was watching me, something hidden in the darkness. And then I saw it. A figure stepped out of the shadows. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long and twisted. Its face was pale, but its features were obscured by a hood, and its eyes glowed with a faint, otherworldly light. I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place as the figure slowly advanced, its movements slow and deliberate. James let out another scream, his voice breaking with terror. "No! Please stop! Don't come any closer!" But the figure didn't stop. It continued its slow march toward him, its steps silent on the snow. James stumbled backward, his legs shaking, but he didn't try to run. He stood there, paralyzed with fear, unable to move. I wanted to scream, to run, to do something, anything, but I couldn't move. I was trapped in place, my body refusing to obey my mind. The figure came closer and closer, its glowing eyes fixed on James, and I could feel the air grow colder, the darkness thickening around us. Suddenly, the figure reached out, its long, skeletal hand brushing against James' arm. He gasped, his body jerking as though an electric shock had passed through him. His skin rippled, and his body seemed to convulse, as though something inside him was fighting to break free. "James!" I screamed, finally breaking free from my paralysis. I rushed toward him, but as I did, the figure turned its glowing eyes toward me. I froze again, a wave of terror crashing over me. The figure's voice was like a whisper in the wind, cold and malevolent. "He belongs to me now." Before I could react, the figure's hand shot out, grabbing hold of my wrist. The pain was excruciating, as though my very soul was being torn from my body. I screamed in agony, my legs giving way beneath me, but the figure held me fast. I could feel the coldness of its touch seep into my bones, draining my strength, my will, my very essence. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The figure released its grip, and I fell to the ground, gasping for air. The pain was gone, but the terror lingered. I looked up, my vision blurred, and saw that James was gone. The clearing was empty, save for the faint traces of his footsteps in the snow, which had already begun to disappear. I was alone. I lay there in the snow, trembling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The woods were silent now, the wind no longer howling. My heart was still racing, and I could still hear the echo of James' screams in my mind. But there was no sign of him. No trace of the figure. And no explanation for what had just happened. I didn't know what had taken my husband, but I knew one thing for sure: whatever it wasn't done with me yet. Christmas was always a time of magic for me as a child. The scent of pine trees, the twinkling lights that seemed to cast a spell over the house, and the warmth of family gathering together made it a season I cherished. But now, as a single mother, the holiday season had become something different, something I dreaded more than I could ever admit. It wasn't that I didn't love Christmas anymore. I did. But after the divorce, after everything fell apart, it felt like a reminder of what I had lost. I was left alone with my daughter, Lily, and the weight of the world on my shoulders. My ex-husband hadn't bothered to call, and my family lived miles away, too far for a visit, and I had no one to lean on. Christmas was supposed to be about family, about joy. But for me, it was a season of quiet struggle. Lily, however, still had her magic. She believed in Santa, in the sparkle of the tree lights, in the warmth of the season. It was my job to protect that, to give her the memories I once had, even if it meant putting on a brave face. I'd scrounged up enough money to buy a second-hand tree and some decorations, though nothing extravagant. The house was small, but it was cozy enough for the two of us. I spent the afternoon decorating, the scent of pine and cinnamon filling the house. Lily eagerly hung the ornaments, her tiny hands struggling to get them just right. We laughed together, talking about what Santa might bring her, though I knew it would be little more than what I could manage to find in discount stores. It didn't matter to her. It mattered to me. As night fell and the last ornament was hung, I sank onto the couch, exhausted but proud of what we had done. Lily had already curled up with her favorite Christmas book, her eyes heavy with sleep. The house was quiet, too quiet, and I found myself staring at the twinkling lights, wondering if it would ever feel like Christmas again. That's when I heard it. A soft thud, like something moving upstairs. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't the first time I'd heard strange noises in this house. Old houses made noises. But this wasn't the creak of settling wood. This was deliberate, like footsteps. I stood up, trying to calm my racing heart. It was probably just the wind, or maybe a mouse in the attic. But the noise came again. Slow. Heavy. Like someone was walking around upstairs. My pulse quickened, and I instinctively glanced toward the stairs. Lily was asleep in her room. I could hear her gentle breathing, blissfully unaware of the unsettling sound coming from above. I grabbed the flashlight from the drawer and slowly ascended the stairs, my feet barely making a sound on the old wooden steps. I reached the top of the stairs, my breath shallow. The house was still, except for the thudding that now sounded like it was coming from the hallway. My pulse raced, and I took one slow step forward, clutching the flashlight as though it could protect me from whatever was making the noise. I reached Lily's room, and the thudding stopped abruptly. I slowly pushed the door open. She was asleep in her bed, her little body curled up beneath the covers, her face serene and peaceful. There was no sign of anyone else in the room. Relief washed over me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I scanned the room, looking for any sign of disturbance. Nothing seemed out of place, but the air felt thick, charged with something I couldn't name. I turned to leave when I spotted it. On the floor, near the corner of the room, was a small, crumpled piece of paper. I bent down to pick it up, my fingers trembling. As I unfolded it, my breath caught in my throat. The message, written in shaky handwriting, read, "He's coming for you." My blood ran cold. I thought it was a prank, maybe a sick joke, but the feeling in the room told me otherwise. I stood there for a moment, staring at the words, trying to make sense of them, but nothing made sense. My mind raced, my heart beating wildly in my chest. I left Lily's room and went back downstairs, the paper still clenched in my hand. My mind was spinning. Was it some twisted joke? Maybe Lily had found it somewhere, or worse, maybe someone had broken in. I locked the doors and made sure every window was secure. But despite all the precautions, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The rest of the night was sleepless. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind that rattled the windows, made me jump. But nothing happened. The house was eerily quiet. The next morning, I tried to shake off the unease. Lily woke up with her usual excitement, eager to see what Santa had left for her. But as I entered the living room, I felt the cold grip of dread settle in my stomach. The stockings we had carefully hung by the fireplace were no longer where we had placed them. One was on the floor, far from its original spot. The tree lights flickered, casting strange shadows across the room. I looked toward the fireplace. The fire had died down to a cold, empty hearth, but it was the footprint that made my blood run cold. A small, child-sized footprint, smeared in soot, led from the fireplace toward the door. It was fresh, as if someone had walked across the floor only moments before. "Mom?" Lily's voice called from behind me, pulling me from my trance. I turned to see her standing in the doorway, looking up at me with wide eyes, her face full of innocence. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," I whispered, trying to calm myself, trying to make it seem like everything was fine. Just stay close to me today, okay?" I didn't want to scare her. But I could feel something was wrong. Deep down I knew it. That night, as I tucked Lily into bed, I couldn't help but feel the overwhelming weight of dread. I kissed her forehead and sat beside her, telling her a Christmas story to try to comfort myself more than her. But even as I spoke, I could feel eyes on me, a presence in the room that wasn't there before. When I heard the first thud downstairs, my heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the house settling. It was deliberate, slow, like someone was walking through my home, my sanctuary, my safe place. I grabbed the flashlight again, but this time, my hand shook so badly I almost dropped it. I crept down the stairs, every step feeling like a mile. As I reached the bottom, I froze. There, in the center of the living room, stood a figure. Tall, cloaked in a tattered red suit that barely clung to its skeletal frame. Its face was obscured by a black hood, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching me, waiting. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped back, but the figure didn't move. The whisper started, low, guttural, and chilling. "He's coming for you." The words pierced me like a dagger. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. The figure raised its hand, as if beckoning me, but I couldn't go near it. I couldn't. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The air was still. The room, cold again, felt empty. I stood there, staring at the empty space where it had been, my heart pounding in my chest. My legs were weak, my body trembling. I couldn't understand what had just happened. Was I losing my mind? Was it a trick of the light? But no. I knew what I saw. The next morning, everything was back to normal. The stockings were back in their place, the tree stood proudly by the window, and Lily was smiling, blissfully unaware of the terror I had experienced. But I knew. The figure hadn't left. It was still there, somewhere. Watching. I tried to push the thought aside, but deep inside, I could feel its presence. A part of me wondered if I'd truly seen what I thought I had, but another part of me, deep in my gut, knew that something sinister was coming. And no matter how hard I tried to protect Lily, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was watching us, it wasn't finished yet. It was still coming. And this time, it would not be satisfied with just a visit.